Safi'jiiva and by extension Xeno'jiiva are in my opinion the two most impactful monsters of the 5th generation. Not necessarily because they ended up being extremely popular, although Safi did manage to crack the number 16 spot in the 20th anniversary popularity poll, but more so because of what radical implications they've had on the lore of the franchise. The idea of a non-black dragon monster being compared to the pinnacle of power that were the forbidden monsters at the time seems sacrilege. Yet Safi not only managed to break that taboo, she also managed to expand our understanding of the Black Dragon's motivations, power, and hierarchy by an amount that's hard to understate. However, I feel the fanbase has dedicated so much of its attention to divulging these new revelations that it's stunted further investigation of the other interesting questions her lore has raised. Chief among them being why Safi'jiiva was given the title of the Red Dragon in the first place. Today I seek to answer that question by putting forward a theory, and in doing so, uncover what exactly the legend of the Red Dragon is all about. Hello and welcome to my channel. I normally post Monster Hunter related content, so if you're interested, it might be worth your time checking out some of my other videos. From postulating whether or not Anjanath could survive the hazards of Skull Island, to proving that Alatreon isn't actually a fraud. And if you do end up enjoying today's video, consider leaving a like, as it helps out a ton. Other than that, let's just jump right back into the video. The Earth itself being saturated by tunnels carrying vast quantities of energy is an idea referenced time and again in the lore of Monster Hunter. Perhaps the two most prominent examples being the Ruined Pinnacle and the subject of today's video, the New World's Everstream. However, a vast system of capillaries capable of feeding an entire continent isn't just some ordinary dragon vein. Instead, the Everstream's origins lay with a series of incredibly powerful elder dragons that each played a pivotal role in its development, beginning with the Serpent King Dragon, Talamadur. Either truly exceptional individuals or prehistoric relatives of the modern species, these quote-unquote Emperor Serpents would lay the foundation for what would later become the Everstream. First by bifurcating the New World with their coiling motions, resulting in the continent's flora and fauna being relatively segregated between those north or south of the Great Ravine. More importantly, its depth near the center of the New World would release a tremendous amount of energy into the Earth itself, luring in another incredibly powerful elder, the Earth-singing dragon Shada-ishvalda. Using its seismic abilities, Shara would carve out a ravine where the ancient serpent's corpse rests. This ravine would encircle a series of highlands that are influenced by yet another high-class elder, the molten mountain dragon Zoramagdaros. Known for their explosive deaths, one of these gigantic mountain dragons met its end near and around the New World's waters. Couple that with an equally powerful secondary explosion, and the marine ecosystems off the coast of the burgeoning continent likely met a gruesome end. Yet castaways ferried across by these two powerful explosions found themselves in the heart of the New World, where presumably feeding off the nascent Everstream, they rapidly evolved into the many species of land coral found across the Coral Highlands. We don't know if it was this or another Zoramagdaros that failed to meet its goal of reaching the Everstream in time, but nevertheless a mountain dragon's corpse would become an island off the coast of the continent. This new piece of land would later be known as the Guiding Lands. With the stage set, the Everstream would grow and develop, as more and more elder dragons, influenced by whatever alien reasoning drives them, would keep making the journey across the sea to meet their end in the ravine carved out by Shada-ishvalda. As their corpses stacked up, coupled with the bodies falling from the Coral Highlands, the ravine's biota would develop, eventually resulting in a species of bacteria evolving to decompose the cacophony of corpses scattered across the rotten vale. This bacteria, alongside rainwater, would stratify the veil, with each layer slowly refining the energies nascent in the corpses of the elder dragons. In the last layer, where rivers of acid crisscross the ravine, the energy would be distilled into the purest form seen anywhere across the planet before eventually sipping into the ground. Once deep beneath the earth, it would pool into lakes of lava. This deep pool of energy is what more commonly the Research Commission calls the Everstream. From it, veins of energy feed the rest of the New World to create its many biomes. What energy isn't siphoned away later accumulates and crystallizes in the Elder's recess, where it reaches its highest concentrations. This cycle of death and rebirth that feeds the Everstream would later be recounted in a fairy tale dubbed The Tale of the Five, for the 5 ancient dragons said to have created the continent. Of course, we know collectively there were way more than just 5 elders responsible for the development of the new world, but nonetheless the story remains. In the Tale of the Five, the first 4 dragons contribute by becoming the land itself. These contributions essentially cover what we've talked about so far with the cycle of death and rebirth. However, the last dragon is different from the rest, as it instead climbs far into the sky to become a star of sapphire blue. What exactly that contribution means, we'll have to deduce by finally talking about the Sapphire Star. The Guiding Lands are an island of anomalies, in which biomes with vastly different climates and ecologies sit atop one another, in an arrangement that couldn't possibly have natural origins, and that's because they don't. As we quickly found out in Iceborne's second title update that these lands' origins lay with the enigmatic red dragon, Safi'jiiva, and its manipulation of earth vein energy, with her having created both the volcanic and tundra regions of the Guiding Lands before the very eyes of the Research Commission, in order to lure in powerful monsters like the Stygian Xen'jiiva. Presumably she also did this with the rest of the Guiding Lands biomes, as evidenced by the fact that each region's dragon bones lay out a similar story to that of Stygian Xen'jiiva's arrival, resulting in a land that acts as a microcosm of the new world. However, this does then beg the question, if Safi'jiiva exploited the dragon veins energy of the Guiding Lands to lure in powerful monsters, dragon veins whose origins lay with the death and rebirth cycle of one incredibly powerful mountain dragon, does this mean the biomes we see in the new world owe their origin to the manipulation of the red monster? Of course, one's first instinct might be to point out that the Rotten Vale and Coral Highlands owe a great deal of their development to other elders. However, just because other elder dragons set the stage for these biomes to exist doesn't necessarily mean Safi'jiiva didn't play a role in their development. Yet without stronger evidence that these lands were subject to artificial manipulation, this hypothesis regarding Safi'jiiva remains pure conjecture. So, is there any evidence? As I'm sure many of you know, Monster Hunter World came out with an official lore book, the spiritual successor to the Hunter's Encyclopedia series of books. This new book, known as Monster Hunter World: The Official Complete Works, is divided up into chapters, the second of which is told from the perspective of a hunter of the Fifth Fleet, rattled with guilt for not being able to recover in time to be a part of the Elder Crossing investigation. With the drive to contribute something of value to his fellows in the Research Commission, they decide to come up with a radical new theory to explain the phenomena of the new world, doing so by retracing the steps of the hunter known as the Sapphire Star. Despite being well traveled and aware of the Commission's accepted hypothesis, that of the cycle of death and rebirth we've talked about so far, constantly his or her mind can't shake off the feeling there's something more. When they reach the ancient forest and see the matrix of plants that constitutes the ancient tree, they think it's some kind of tower-like structure. This idea is later bolstered by the forest's unusually efficient trophic recycling and odd placement, which acts as a bulwark against oceanic breeze that would otherwise strip the continent of much life. I'd like to add to this that the developers' intentions when designing the ancient forest were that the deeper a player goes into it, and by extension higher, the stronger the monsters get. When you tally all of this up, you come to the conclusion that the forest is some kind of battle tower, impeccably designed to be a breeding ground for powerful wyverns, which are then added to the streamlined trophic cycle. At first glance, the existence of the Wildspire Way seems to directly contradict its notion. After all, while more verdant than other desert biomes explored across the series, it's still comparatively barren when pit up against the ancient forest. So, is there an explanation? Well, our hunter speculates that by looking at the geological strata of the waste, it would indicate that massive crustal deformations had occurred in the distant past. These deformations are likely the result of previous elder crossings, and may have potentially cut off access to dragon veins that would have otherwise reached the waste, resulting in an uneven distribution of energy that sapped the locale of much of its life. Our hunter even postulates that the Wildspire Waste could have been as verdant as the ancient forest in the past, citing the many marches of the locale as evidence that the Wildspire is still in a period of transition from the once humid forest to the more arid conditions of the present. They also talk as though the giant Wildspire at its center acts as a temple of sorts, a symbol of the Everstream's influence and uneven distribution. We'll get into what possible implications that can mean later. For now, let's take a look at the Highlands and Vale to see what our hunter friend has to say about them. To start off with, the hunter put forward the hypothesis that the land coral found in the Highlands managed to adapt due to the Everstream's influence. They also note that the balanced cycle of rain pouring into the Vale and limiting the effluvian's population seems artificial. In fact, they view the entire dynamic of the Highlands and Vale as too perfect, pointing out how the stark transition between climate zones feels unnatural. Sound familiar? Once again, they can't shake off the feeling that the ecosystems of the New World feel like the will of a monster, going as far as to state that Legiana was placed as the guardian of the Highlands and by extension, the Vale. The instant our hunter finally reached the Elder's Recess, their first thought is that it looks like a shrine or castle built by the gods. They later expand in an attempt to synthesize their numerous theories into one cohesive explanation, concluding that the New World is a massive organism that lives in symbiosis with the Elder Dragons, drawing them in to create pitch-perfect ecosystems for its organisms, which the Elders are implied to want. You see, there's a few suggestions throughout the lore that Elder Dragons are aware of the impact their tremendous energy reserves can have. The Everstream offers them a means by which that energy can take on new meaning in the form of new life. However, as you might be able to deduce, our hunter's initial suggestion was a bit off, as it doesn't account for Xeno'jiiva. They initially brushed that off by suggesting that the Everstream sent out a distress signal when the parasitic dragon attached to it, and that humans, who are in some way related to Elder Dragons, responded to the call in the same manner as the Elders had responded in the past, meaning case closed, right? Despite some initial food for thought regarding the Safi'jiiva hypothesis, the hunter's theory and ours deviate on what exactly we believe to be the guiding force. Any further imposition on my part would simply be conjecture, correct? Well, my friends, despite initially disregarding Xeno'jiiva as merely a third party taking advantage of the Everstream's enormous energy reservoir, our hunter, when reaching the birthplace of the Emperor of Elder Dragons, has this to say. Xeno'jiiva learned of the coming deaths of the Elder Dragons and redirected them from the Rotten Vale to the confluence of fate to aid its own birth. I ponder once again what Xeno'jiiva means to this serene new world. I suggested that Xeno'jiiva is a calamity, a distress signal from the New World. However, isn't it possible it organized the Everstream's energy in the New World? Did humans end the cycle of nature when we subdued Xeno'jiiva? No, we did not. Xeno'jiiva's existence became untenable when it gathered too much Everstream energy. Looking up at the heart of this new world, I am proud, as a member of the 5th Fleet, that we were able to stop Xeno'jiiva. Now, to be fair, they do discredit the idea that Xeno is the mastermind behind the Everstream by pointing out its untenable nature. However, not only does this strike me as a bit of a coping mechanism to not have to deal with the potential ramifications of what the 5th Fleet had just committed, but on top of that, our hunter doesn't have the benefit of hindsight to realize that Xeno is just the immature form of the actual mastermind behind the New World, and like any toddler, could potentially be self-destructive if left to its own devices. And it seems the Xeno we fought was in fact left alone, as Safi's interest drifted over time to the Guiding Lands. In fact, the evidence for Xeno, or what we know now to more likely be Safi, is so self-evident that the Seeker and Admiral come to a similar conclusion as our hunter's revelation. Keep in mind, these two have been researching the New World for over 40 years now, and independently of our fellow hunter, reached the same logical through line. If you need more proof that Safi was the actual mastermind behind the biomes of the New World, consider this. After helping the Sapphire Star solve the mystery behind the Elder Crossing, the nameless handler leaves us with her final thoughts. When remarking about how similar their journey had been to the Tale of the Five, the handler concludes by stating that she believes Xeno'jiiva to be the Sapphire Star and that it had lured the commission to the New World. If this is to be believed, it cements Xeno, and by extension Safi, as having contributed to the New World's development, given the fact they're a central figure in its creation myth. It also synthesizes nicely with our hunter's previous theory that the new world called out to humans. It just so happens that the caller was Xeno, and that the message likely wasn't a distress signal. This does then raise the question of why? Why would Safi'jiiva go to all the trouble of cultivating these near-perfect biomes? Well, to answer that, we need to take a closer look at Safi'jiiva's lore. Before answering why Safi'jiiva would go through all this trouble, I think it's important we first listen to some words of wisdom by the Nameless Handler, in that treating elder dragons like ordinary creatures will lead to mistakes, but forgetting they are creatures at all will blind us to the truth. I take this to mean that Safi'jiiva's motivations are multifaceted, with some being sexual and others more derived. Iceborne is purposely vague with Safi's motives, beyond telling us that it's clearly looking out for its own self-interest. However, there are enough clues left behind by the developers to start figuring out some potential candidates. Let's take a look at some of them, shall we? The first of these motivations, and the one with undoubtedly the most lore backing it, has to be reproduction.
Oh yes! Oh my god, I'm gooning! Oh, I'm coming! Oh my god, I'm coming! Yeah!
As any biologist worth their salt would tell you, if evolution had any goal, that goal would be to goon max. Safi'jiiva is no different. In fact, it's one of the few elders we have a pretty good idea of how they reproduce, with the red monster asexually reproducing by first building a cocoon in which it deposits a sapphire of the Emperor, or equivalent amount of bioenergy into. And that's just the energy required to fertilize the cocoon, let alone the additional energy required for an Emperor of Elder Dragons to develop. Mind you, the Xeno we slay in the story takes a minimum of multiple decades worth of bioenergy absorption from the Confluence of Fates, the place with the highest concentration of bioenergy on the planet, to a close out of its cocoon. On top of that, we still don't have a good idea of how much bioenergy it takes Xeno to molt into Safi, but it's at least enough that not even an Arch-Tempered worth of difference is sufficient. To give you an idea of how insane that is, the bioenergy levels of even a threat level tempered 1 monster, like Pookie, are comparable to those of a base elder. And reminder, we're talking about Arch-Tempered here, so the gap would be even wider. Needless to say, but for even one Safi'jiiva to come into existence requires a ludicrous amount of energy, and no naturally occurring deposit of bioenergy, whether it be Elder Dragon or Earthfane, can reach the concentrations required. Meaning, in order to facilitate its own existence, the red monster needs to create these rich wells of bioenergy. The Safi'jiiva we see in-game managed to do this by exploiting the already developing Everstream. However, if left to its own devices, the Everstream likely wouldn't have reached the concentrations required to give birth to Xeno'jiiva. Yet how does the Red Dragon's meddling help facilitate the accumulation of bioenergy? Well, for starters, the trophic cycle of the Highlands and Vale is obviously what created the Everstream in the first place. Meaning if the Red Dragon played a role in developing those ecosystems, then it by necessity is helping further its own interests. More importantly, and something that I touched upon earlier, the ecosystems of the New World are set up in a way to breed strong monsters. And thanks to Nergigante's feeding habits, we know that to some degree all monsters produce bioenergy, and that the stronger the monster is, the purer/more they have of it. This fact positions the New World's ecosystems to act as factories that pump out bioenergy-rich monsters. The Elder Crossing also plays a pivotal role in this, as whenever a migrating Elder crosses the New World, it redraws the ecological map, forcing monsters to become stronger in response to new species and conditions. We see this process take place during both Zora's crossing and Velkhana's arrival, with the former drawing out powerful subspecies and the latter new apexes. With these factors in play, the biomes themselves may offset much of their costs by producing their own bioenergy. This is likely the reason why each locale's trophic recycling is so unnaturally efficient, as it helps maximize each biome's self-sufficiency. However, this still fails to answer why Safi would bother running any of these biomes at all, self-sufficient or not. Why waste any resources on locales that likely don't contribute much if at all to the Everstream's energy reserves? Well, the answer lies in the logical conclusion of the fact we mentioned earlier: Elder Dragons and Tempered monsters. At first glance, these two answers seem contradictory. Elder dragons are already attracted by the Elder Crossing, and the tempered monsters feed off the Everstream's energy, so if anything they would be a tax on bioenergy, not a boon, right? Well, for starters, while Elder dragons are attracted by the Elder Crossing, many of them also live and reproduce on the continent itself. This in turn secures future stock for more Elder Crossing events, and given how rare Elder dragons are, in order to maximize this gain, Safi needs to introduce biomes that a variety of elders can acclimate to. If the red monster solely focuses on the highlands and Vale, not nearly as many elders could adapt, thus limiting the potential pool of Elder Crossing candidates. What about tempered monsters then? How could they possibly be a boon if the bioenergy they gain is taken from the land? Well, tempered monsters essentially act as refineries. Let me explain. Remember what I said about stronger monsters having more/purer bioenergy? Well, the latter half of that statement is what matters most here. Tempered monsters take in raw bioenergy from the land and refine it into pure crystallized bioenergy. This crystallized form of bioenergy, also known as dragon crystals, is everywhere in the Elder's Recess and is what Xeno'jiiva primarily feeds off of. It's what allowed the Confluence of Fates to reach its absurd concentrations of bioenergy, leading to the Xeno'jiiva station there expedited development when compared to its peers in the secluded valley. These dragon crystals normally take grinding down from the Vale as well as geological activity from the Everstream to form. This process likely takes an excruciatingly long time to complete. However, tempered monsters complete the refinement process within their bodies, as continuous battle will crystallize their internal bioenergy into stream stones. The higher the threat level tempered monster, the bigger/purer the stone. This is likely what the red monster is after, as the payout of a gleaming string stone produced by a tempered threat level 3 monster is massive, each one exponentially expediting the development of a Xeno'jiiva. However, these tempered monsters can only exist in environments rich in bioenergy that force monsters to grow stronger and have the right type of climate. All boxes that the biomes of the New World, as we've discussed, clear perfectly. And if for whatever reason you're still skeptical of the idea that Safi would go through all the trouble of managing multiple regions just to attract a few powerful monsters, keep in mind this is what we're directly told to be her motivations in the Guiding Lands, which by now you should know acts as a microcosm of the New World. Oh, and wouldn't you know it, when your hunter finally fully develops a region in the Guiding Lands, what does that culminate with? Of course, it's the Temper 3 monsters again, except this time they drop Spirit Vein Gems and Bones, which are directly compared to Stream Stones. This setup would also explain why Xeno would bother attracting humans to the New World. As evidenced by your hunter forcibly developing a Guiding Lands region by repeatedly massacring wyverns, and honestly the Sapphire Star's journey in general, humans, and specifically elite hunters, can force monsters to adapt and evolve. It's kind of the whole point of the franchise. Xeno just likely underestimated how resilient humans would be when faced with an existential crisis, which is a common trend you see amongst elder dragons. This miscalculation ended up costing the Emperor of Elders its life. However, for as convincing as all of this is, it still fails to answer why Safi would bother with structures like the giant Wildspire. So, for the next section of this video, I want to focus on the less animalistic side of Safi and more so on the intelligence behind the Red Dragon. Elder dragons being more intelligent than humans is a commonly held belief about them in the universe. It's also a well-supported belief, with many elders exhibiting behaviors that are commonly associated with sapience, such as self-awareness, pride in their abilities, complex planning, and a sense of beauty. Safi'jiiva showcases many of these traits and is even praised as a clever combatant. I think it's prudent to assume part of Safi's motivations lie outside of the instinctual drive to reproduce. In fact, this notion is even bolstered by the Seeker's own comments, which directly compare Safi's terraforming ventures to ours. Humans will build great structures to of course facilitate survival and procreation, but we also build stuff because we like to. Architects design buildings to not only be structurally sound, but pretty too. And what is Safi'jiiva if not the architect of the new world? Structures like the giant wildspire could have been placed there for simply no other reason than Safi simply enjoyed them being there. Before risking the next section of this video sounding like complete conjecture, I do have some evidence that this may be the case. In the second chapter of Monster Hunter World The Official Complete Works, our hunter friend has a few interesting remarks. As I've already mentioned, he views the giant wildspire in the waste as sort of a temple, the ancient tree as a tower, and the dragon crystal complex in the Elder's Recess as a shrine. In particular, the Elder's Recess being compared to a shrine, or more importantly a castle, is very interesting to me, since I don't think it's pure coincidence or a byproduct of natural selection that the monster whose moniker is literally the Emperor of Elder Dragons resides here. In fact, it's directly stated to us by the developers that the recess was designed specifically to house Xeno'jiiva. In other words, a way to look at the Elder's Recess is a pristine, crystalline castle for a king of kings whose subjects tend to be revered as deities themselves. What I want to focus on now is his comments regarding the Coral Highlands. The ever-present natural beauty of the place makes him ponder if monsters are attracted to it because they have a sense of aesthetics. Eventually, this thought is developed into thinking that the New World's ecosystems exemplify their beauty and their immaculate efficiency, leading me to think that to some degree, Safi has a sense of aesthetic when designing her ecosystems. However, this might not just be because Safi is pleased with the biome's aesthetics. She may actually feel inclined to create a great tapestry of life in the New World, as a way of commemorating the dead elders whose life force she uses. As I mentioned earlier in this video, there are implications elders know about the impact their deaths can have on the world and seek out an outcome in which that death can bring about new life. Safi herself may even be influenced by the Elder Dragon's wills and desires, considering many descriptions for Elder Dragon armor remark how the hunter can still feel the will of the monster. Who's to say their bioenergy doesn't carry this same trait? This idea is even given some further backing due to comments our hunter makes regarding the Elder Dragon's wills affecting the Everstream. All food for thought, but moving on to more evidence-based speculation, Safi's final motivation may be her most important: combat. As we talked about in the reproduction section of this video, Safi'jiiva has thoroughly designed the New World to be a bioenergy factory. However, Safi doesn't just use bioenergy to reproduce, it also uses it to attack and defend itself. By building up a massive reservoir of bioenergy, Safi's created a land in which it can utilize its abilities to the fullest, to the point it took the Sapphire Star and multiple groups of elite hunters several expeditions to drain it of its reserves, to finally even have a chance at killing it. Mind you, these hunters would have had access to Elder Dragon armor that grants the user special abilities such as regeneration or electrokinesis, the Clutch Claw that's hyper effective against Safi's scale pattern, and of course Elder Seal weapons, which would have made the whole ordeal more efficient. Yet even with all of that, Safi was still unbeatable until its reserves could be drained. But you wanna know what's really crazy? She could have been harder. Had she decided to rest in the Confluence of Fates, which is confirmed to have higher bioenergy reserves than the Secluded Valley, she likely would have beaten back the Commission. However, what could possibly justify such extreme countermeasures? What monsters could possibly threaten the mother of the Emperor of Elder Dragons? Oh, right. Yes, my friends, it always comes back to the Black Dragons. But why? Why would they decide to attack Safi? Or why would Safi view them as an inherent threat? Well, we might have explored what the Legend of the Red Dragon is all about, that of a creator deity that attracts and orchestrates the life force of dead dragons to bring about verdant paradises. That still doesn't explain why it was necessary to give the Red Dragon that legend and not just any other elder. Or why not even turn it into another Black Dragon like how it was originally intended to? In order to answer that, we need to examine Safi's relationship with the Black Dragons, meaning unfortunately for you guys, you'll have to wait until my next video, in which I'll be comparing the red monster of the Secluded Valley to the symbol of destruction of the Sacred Land. And that's all I've got for today, folks. If you liked what you saw, consider leaving a like and maybe even subscribing to the channel, as this helps the channel grow and it helps me bring you more videos like this. If you really like what you saw, then consider watching these videos Google says you'll like. Other than that, have a lovely rest of your day.